Okay, well, welcome to Shuttleworth, and welcome to, for me, the most favourite day of the year, which is Navy Day. Basically, that's because I'm ex-Navy. I'm the only ex-Fleet Air Arm pilot, and so this is the most fun day of the year for me. And this is one of our feature aircraft, the Sea Hurricane Mark 1B, owned by the collection and operated by us all year round at all the events. And it's unique. It's the only flying Sea Hurricane in the world. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about it, a little bit about its history and the history of Sea Hurricanes, and then talk a little bit about what it's like to fly. So this aircraft was restored and flown in the 90s, 1995. Its history comes from pretty much the stable of Sea Hurricanes, and Sea Hurricanes were originally designed as carrier catapult aircraft off the old merchant vessels. So they were designed as fighter aircraft that would be launched off a rail on a merchantman to go and shoot down German long-range reconnaissance and long-range fighter bombers that would come and try and bomb the fleet. Now that sounds great, doesn't it? Not a very good mission, because it's a one-way mission. Because you launch off a merchantman on a rail, on a rocket-assisted rail, you fly around, you do your mission, and then you have to ditch alongside the ship, and then they get the ship's boat out and they come and rescue you from there and pull you off the aircraft. So you can imagine sitting there on an Arctic convoy or on a convoy across the Atlantic waiting to be called out, and then finding that you've got the one-way mission. You get fired off the catapult, you go and hopefully shoot down the German aeroplane, and then you ditch alongside in the water. And the ditching characteristics of these aeroplanes are not great, and as you've probably seen from some of the old footage and the pictures. Hurricanes like this one, and this is a Mark 1B, were modified from standard production Hurricanes to turn them into Sea Hurricanes, and there are two facets that mark this out as a 1B. First of all, it's the arrestor hook on the back end, and that was designed for later operations when they came onto the aircraft carriers as we know them today, with wires that catch the aircraft when it lands on merchant ships that were modified for aircraft carriers. And the catapult area, if you look under the wing, you can see just under there some red lugs that sit under there. That's the other aspect that makes it a Sea Hurricane. That's where it sat on the catapult, the mountings that it sat on from there for it to be fired off the front. You'll also see this mechanism here. A tube would go through the fuselage, and that's how it would sit on this very short catapult on the merchant ships. As a consequence of that, although in this particular aircraft this is a dummy hook now, it can't be used, it can't be deployed. The hook and the hook mechanism are quite heavy, and that requires normally a metal prop on the front end. We've modified this aircraft so it's got a wooden prop and a dummy hook, so it's actually a lighter aeroplane. It's powered by a Merlin Mark III, which is an early mark of Merlin, and it's relatively underpowered compared with the later marks, so much less horsepower. This one probably generates around about 900 horsepower at sea level, which means it's not quite as sprightly as some of its colleagues in Mark IIs, and it's not quite as sprightly as the later Spitfires either. So that's how it was operated. As I say, most of them were modified. This one was built in Canada in 1941. It was shipped across to the UK. It was then modified to become from a standard Hurricane 1B to a Sea Hurricane 1B with the hook and those mountings that I've just described. And then it was set to go and join 880 Squadron, Naval Air Squadron, I think it was serving on Indefatigable. It got picked up by the squadron in 1942. And then it was about to deploy to the ship, it developed a fault and then came back ashore, so it never went on board. And that's probably one of the reasons it survived today, because 880 Naval Air Squadron went on to perform on the Malta convoys, basically in the time they were trying to liberate or try to support Malta by dropping Spitfires on board and getting merchantmen in to resupply Malta. This aircraft would have taken part in that particular campaign, and that particular campaign was quite high on attrition, for those of you who who've probably read up or who know about, I think it's Op Palliser. I think it's Palliser. I think that's right. Yes. So that campaign, that's where it would have gone. But luckily for us, it never made it. It then went back into storage, into maintenance, and then saw out the war years, and then subsequently. They were going to restore it for the Battle of Britain film. There was too much maintenance required to get it up to speed ready for the Battle of Britain film, and then gradually it got a slower restoration, which is why we fly it today. So that's a bit about its history and what the aircraft did. What is it like to fly? Well, you've probably seen, as I have, those interviews with those that were lucky enough to fly operationally both Hurricanes and Spitfires, and they wax lyrical about both of them. They're equally supportive of the qualities of a Hurricane and qualities of a Spitfire. The things that I pull out from that, and the things that I've seen from when you fly it, is that this one in particular, definitely much less power than than its Spitfire counterparts, but you'll notice quite a thick wing chord, so it's quite manoeuvrable, turns quite tightly at slow speed, and for that reason it was good in dogfighting because it was a stable gun platform, and it was able to get to turn corners quickly, quite agile, and get into a good firing position. It wasn't good in a drag race or when you're trying to outmaneuver or outpower your opposition, because it didn't have the grunt that other aircraft had, like an ME-109. So if you could sneak up on an ME-109 and you could tuck in and maneuver, good guns platform, good ability to shoot it down, but when you're into a raw performance fight, you're never going to get the same match. Another reason why people like Hurricane, its wooden construction as well, it was quite battle hardened. It could take quite a few hits before it really became unserviceable. And certainly when they were turning it around, Hurricanes, you could make small repairs to the fuselage and get it back out there quite quickly. So again, that was another reason why it enjoyed one of the facets why it was good operational performer. But in terms of raw performance, it's not really matched to a Spitfire or 109. That said, what is it like to handle? Well, it handles quite differently from some of its counterparts and perhaps some of the other aircraft in the collection. And what I mean by that is most people, when you see them do their first flight in a Hurricane, they come back and they look a bit wistful because it kind of didn't fly like they were expecting. And one of the reasons for it is its flying characteristics. So for instance, when you see it later today diving down to do its first approach and a fast swooping part of the display, and it pulls up. Traditionally on an aircraft, you pull the stick back, you apply a force, houses get smaller, you climb away from the ground, and you apply and you hold a force. With the Hurricane, when you start to pull up, initially you pull back on the stick and then it tucks, and then it wants to fly itself around the corner, and you find yourself feeding in forward stick and just holding it off. Now, the first time you do that, it feels quite unstable and quite unnatural. But actually, when you realise you fly it a few times, it's very repeatable. It does exactly the same activity happens every time you fly it. So you build that sense of how to control it. But that's why when you first fly it, it feels just a little bit different. So it doesn't quite handle, perhaps in a way a traditional aircraft would in that respect. That said, once you talk to people who've flown it for hours and hours and operationally, that little foible has been forgotten long in their training, and as far as they're concerned, it handles beautifully. That's why you'll always hear people being very supportive about the Hurricane, because indeed it does handle very well. Another thing about this particular aircraft is that you'll see, if you compare it with the other Hurricane that I think is in the hangars, you'll see it's got a shorter, snubbier nose, a smaller engine compartment based on the fact it's got a smaller supercharger and a smaller radiator. This aircraft is more prone to overheating, so one thing we do when we fly it here, the display, making it fly fast, we'll always take it behind the crowd and cool it down before we land, just to make sure we preserve the engine, because it's all about preserving this aircraft for flying as long as possible. We apply the requisite amount of power to get it going and get it displaying nicely, but we don't fly it at the same supercharged boost levels as they would have done operationally. We hang back. You only fly it at moderate power settings. You don't fly it right with throttle parked in the corner at full power. So you'll always cool this one down, and at some last couple of years we've had an engine change. This engine's behaving a bit more. The last engine was right up on its temperature limits, so we used to land it and then almost pretty much straight away pull it into a parking slot, run it for about a minute, let the engine temperature stabilize, and then shut it down immediately to stop it overheating. Not the same issue as on a Spitfire, where with the gear down the Spitfire covers the radiator and it starts to overheat with the gear down. This one is purely a function of the efficiency of the radiator and its ability to dissipate the heat. In terms of taxiing it, this aircraft, like all aircraft of its era, has pneumatic brakes. And so they're controlled by, on the hand grip, there's a spade grip and there's a paddle that you squeeze. And when you squeeze that, it applies air pressure into the brakes, into the discs on the, on the main wheels. If you apply rudder, so if you want to turn right, you apply the right rudder and then you squeeze on the brake. That means only the right brake will work in that extreme. It will hold the brake and then you'll move around to the right. Similarly, if you want to go left, squeeze and it moves around to the left. Two things about pneumatic brakes is because it's air, it has basically a lag in it. And so you can see people when if they're looking a little drunk when they're taxiing it, it's probably for two reasons. One is you're supposed to weave because you can't really see very well over the nose, although the visibility in a Hurricane is better than some other aeroplanes. The other reason is he's probably getting used to working out the lag between when you squeeze and when actually the brake comes on, and that takes a little bit of getting used to get that right. Of course, the excuse is he's just weaving to make sure there's no one ahead, but the reality is he's actually trying to learn how to control it when he's going down the hill for the first time. So that takes a bit of getting used to, and with all these, the brakes fade as well, so they're not great brakes. So when you're landing in a crosswind and you really need to keep that brake holding you straight, after a while the brake will fade, so you only have a number of shots on the brake in order to make sure you can keep it straight from there. In terms of engine handling, as I've said before, with these old engines, you really need to look after them these days. We're not here to fly them operationally, we're here to display them, so it's always very careful handling. It is relatively carefree. You can apply throttle fairly swiftly with it. You won't flood the engine like you will with the Gladiator or with the Lysander in the Mercury engine, and it's quite responsive. It has a variable pitch propeller, and you have a separate control that it changes the pitch on the propeller as well for when you want to fly in different conditions with different speeds. So on the ground you have it in a fine condition, so it's more efficient when you're taking off from very slow speed, and then when you're flying around up and away you move it into a coarser position, so it's more efficient when you're traveling fast. And you can see there's a mechanism that's driven through oil on the front end of the cowling, the front end of the nose cone from there. This particular aircraft was equipped with 8 .303 caliber guns on each side, and you can see where they've covered off the front. I'm not sure the guns are still fitted in the wing. I must find that out. But they always put cloth over the front, and that tells the ground crew whether they've actually fired out or not. And less so on the ship, but more so probably on the Battle of Britain when they're coming back with Hurricanes and knowing whether they need to resupply with bullets as well as fuel ready for the next trip of the day. So that's probably it in a nutshell. On its first flight, the undercarriage, another facet of it, it's another interesting handling gotcha for it, is the undercarriage and the flap are controlled by one lever alone. And it's like a little bit of a gearbox where it has a neutral position, and you go left and up and down for gear up and down, and you go right up and down for flap. Now, if you think about that when you're on the ground, if you get that wrong, then it gets pretty embarrassing, because if you're putting the flap up on the ground and you go the wrong way on that lever, you'll fold the undercarriage and end up flat. So if you see a Hurricane taxiing along and doing that, that's probably what's just happened, is the guys moved the wrong way. So we're very careful about how we move that. And I'm touching wood now, I'm flying it later. I really don't want to talk about it and then find out I demonstrate it later on, because that would be a bad thing. But that's another little gotcha with this, is you've got to be very careful when you land back on and you're cleaning up the aircraft and reconfiguring it. You've got to be very careful where you move that switch so you don't fold the undercarriage inadvertently.